Number 4. Before I dive into this, I do not believe in paranormal stuff for the most part, but this one convinces me otherwise when I think back to it. My middle brother had committed suicide when he was 18. I was 17 and it was tragic. It ripped our family apart. We fought endlessly about who caused him to do it and who was to blame. 7 years later, I came home and the house we were raised in was being put back on the market. I was visiting and looking after the house while my parents were away and couldn't look after it. I was completely alone in the house and all the rooms except the master bedroom were completely cleaned out. My brother's room was down the hall from the master bedroom where I was sleeping. He didn't do the act in his bedroom. He decided to do it in one of his favourite smoke spots. Growing up, my parents took me and my two brothers camping a lot, and my middle brother would always manage to bring home river stones from our adventures. Round rocks almost spherical, and are hard to find anywhere other than a riverbed. He would take the roundest one and bring it home, and he collected hundreds of them over the years. We had distributed them evenly throughout the family, and none remained in that house. It's about 2 a.m, and I'm taking a leak when I hear a door creak open in the house. This startled me because all the doors were shut firmly. Doors in this house had to be forced open and closed, so even the door was open slightly, it still wouldn't budge with a strong wind. But this door was completely closed. It was the door to my brother's room. I turned on the hall light and slowly crept into the room. I turned on the lights and saw absolutely nothing but an empty room. After a few minutes of inspecting, I look on the windowsill to see an almost otherworldly round river stone. There is no way it was there prior because I had looked the house over top to bottom and the river stone was nowhere in the house. Absolutely shaking, I stood there glued to the spot staring at the river stone. I grabbed the stone and held it in my hands for a moment and felt the room get a bit colder. The hair on my arms rose all the way and I felt as if someone was in the room with me. I became extremely overwhelmed with sadness and remorse. After a minute I managed to unglue myself and proceed to the kitchen and pour myself a glass of bourbon. I sat there for the rest of the night going through old photos that were in the scrapbook on the dresser in the master bedroom. My parents arrived the next morning and I was passed out drunk on the kitchen table with dry tears covering my cheeks. After explaining what happened and showing my parents the stone, we all sobbed for at least an hour. My parents took this as a sign to let him go. They had held on to his ashes for an entire time, and so we called my older brother and decided to hold an impromptu memorial service, and we released his ashes in the backyard. We combed them into the soil of the flower beds and grass and garden, the same backyard we had grown up in. Number 3. I might be too late for this, Fred, but I felt I need to tell my story. The best way to describe my family situation is that at this point I'm convinced there's something that is living or dwelling in my house along with my family. It bothers me to even write it down because I feel talking about it may invoke some level of awareness among this thing that lives in my house, but it would really help for someone to hear my story. We moved way out to the country 5 years ago, to a farm about 15 miles away from the city, and about 5 miles away from any town. My nearest neighbour is half a mile away, and it's nothing but barren fields between us. Ever since we moved in, we have heard things at night. Most of the time it's wild animals, and we dealt with a rat infestation the first year as well. That was scary in its own right. But occasionally we will hear things, from time to time, that I simply cannot rationalise to some animal, and believe me, I've tried. I have a 3-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son, who I love more than anything, and I feel the need to protect them at all costs, but only once in the entire time we have lived there have I actually felt threatened by this presence. Most often it is the sound of a little girl like my daughter, similar age, speaking and playing. The most vivid account was when my wife and I were walking upstairs and we heard a little girl playing in our bedroom, and I turned to my wife and said, "Oh, she's going to be in so much trouble for not being asleep, as we thought it was my daughter." But when I saw my wife, she was completely pale, because she was holding the baby monitor and could see both our kids sound asleep in their bed. Another example that stands out in my mind was when it was late, like midnight, and I was downstairs working on my laptop. I heard my daughter behind me ask, "Daddy, why are you so angry?" I replied to her that I wasn't angry, only to realise that my daughter had been asleep for 3 hours and there was nothing behind me. The only terrifying experience was on a night. I was lying in bed and my wife was downstairs working on the computer again. This was around midnight. Suddenly, out of the quietness, we both heard a knocking, like someone knocking at the door. We ignored it thinking it was an animal, but the knocking just got louder and more aggressive. Finally, out of nowhere, the entire house shook, and the knocking was so loud it woke the kids up. I'll never forget that. My wife ran upstairs, terrified, and in order to calm everyone down, I made up a story about a raccoon, but the next day there were no footprints in the snow. I could go on with more stories, but I don't see the point, honestly. I don't even know why I wrote this. I guess I just find it comforting that someone else out there is reading this and it's not just locked away in my family's fears anymore. Number 2. I've lived in a couple of haunted places, so there's a lot of stories I could tell you. I'll just go with a couple from where I lived in Georgia, with my now ex, who I'll call X. Also worth noting that most of this happened in the middle of the day, as opposed to night. We lived next door to X's mother, who was also our landlady. Our house setup was in my bedroom, was between X's room, that could look out into the living room, yes we had separate rooms, and the bathroom, which was a door at the end of the short hallway. Although from my bed you could see the end of the hall opposite the bathroom, the doorway to the living room was to the right of the wall. The front door opened to the living room. There was a laundry room off the living room to the left of the front door. If you walked straight through the living room, you'd go into the kitchen. There was a doorway about halfway across the living room on the right to the hall, where the bedrooms and bathroom were. Anyway, one afternoon, X went next door to her mother's. After some time, I heard the front door open and close. What I assumed was X walking across the living room to the kitchen. After 5 to 10 minutes, I texted to ask why she didn't come and say hi, or at least let me know she was home, which she always did. She replied that she was still at her mother's. So I jumped my lazy ass up and looked everywhere. It was a small house, no real hiding spots. Both front and back doors were locked. Front door couldn't completely lock from inside, or outside, without a key. And the back door could only unlock from inside because we didn't have a spare key. Of course there was no one in the house, and this was middle of the day, sun shining. I had tons of incidents where my ceiling fan would turn on by itself. You had to pull a chain on it and make sure the wall switch was on. Using the wall switch would turn the light on, so the only way I used the fan itself was by pulling the cord. If I wanted the light off but the fan on, I'd use the light pull cord. Finally I got sick of having to keep getting up to turn it off, so I just said out aloud, "Knock it off!" and it stopped happening. I crossed state to visit my family. One night, the only nightmare incident I recall, my ex texts me, freaking out. She was laying in my bed, watching TV with the dog, when the bedroom doorknob started shaking, like someone trying to open it. The doorknob on the door did not have a lock, so if someone had been trying to open it, they could have easily. The dog just looked at the door uneasily. I told X to politely ask out loud for it to stop. I told her to tell whatever that they were scaring her. She did, and it stopped. One day, again the middle of the day, I was on bed, on the computer, when I felt watched, so I looked up. At the end of the hallway I saw a tallish guy. His head was a few inches from the ceiling. He had brown hair, broad shoulders, was wearing a red checkered shirt and blue overalls. There was not a full man there. He was kind of see-through, for lack of a better term, and about halfway down was nothing. No legs, I don't remember hands, but his arms were at his sides. I stared a bit, kind of surprised because obviously I looked away quick. Not sure why, looked back and he was gone. The last story I'll tell is this. This was after X and I broke up, so I was living there alone. I'm standing in my room and I hear the water turn on in the bathroom. Kind of puzzling, but I go in and turn it off, make sure nothing seems loose. Go back into my room, water comes on. Okay, this is weird. I shut the water off again, go back to my room. As soon as I cross the threshold, the water turns back on again, pretty much full force. I'm a little freaked, but more pissed because I now have to pay all the bills on my own. So I yelled something to the effect of I knew they were having fun with me, but I had to pay the water bill, so please knock it off. And the water turned off. I pretty much just said thank you and sat down. As I said, I grew up in a house where weird things happened, so you kind of get numb to it, I guess, a bit anyway. Number 1. I can't actually confirm this is paranormal, but due to the fact that there was only, one other option, it seemed paranormal at the time. This may seem like a mild, maybe even lame experience, but it really freaked us out. Now, this one is rather short and not very fulfilling, but it's a story nonetheless. Every summer, my family and I travelled back east to visit our extended family in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Often, when we're there, we'll have other relatives come by and hang out with us. One summer we were staying at my aunt's house, which had a basement, main floor, then an upstairs. Upstairs were 2 giant rooms, although only one of them had been finished at the time. My cousin had been given permission to stay over for the night, which I was ecstatic about, considering me and him are really close friends. It was just us 2 upstairs with our sleeping bags and whatnot. For the sake of this, I'm going to call my cousin Jack, since I don't want to give out his real name. Jack and I were often the ones who went to bed last, whenever he spent the night. We'd always stay up together watching YouTube or TV, playing on our phones, normal stuff. We positioned our sleeping bags near an outlet and started to charge our phones. We took turns, since it was only one outlet, and we wanted to make our 2 sleeping bags into one giant thing. It gets rather cold during nights, even in the summer. Well, we started to jokingly mess with each other's phones, and I believe it was his turn for the charger, so I moved myself to the other side of the bed, and he starts to shuffle around the blankets. He asked me where the charger was, but I didn't know where. It probably had fallen out of the outlet. I recall the outlets upstairs being loose, and lost in the bed. When we switched sides, we looked under the pillows, under the blankets, under everything. No luck. We looked around the whole room, without any finding of the charger. It was at that point that my aunt had knocked on the door and asked us to keep it down. The room is directly above the master bedroom. We shrugged it off and headed downstairs and into the living room, deciding to watch some TV to pass the time, since neither of us felt tired. After a few episodes of a show we liked to binge together, we decided to go back upstairs and quietly look for the charger. We tiptoed up the steps and into the room, but something was off. We slowly approached the bed until we finally saw it. The charger was on one of our pillows. Out in the open, we were so close to freaking out. I know this sounds like a little joke, but it actually gave us quite the startle. Well, fact or fantasy? You decide. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe as it really helps me out, and I'll be back with more soon.